In the fading twilight of British imperialism in North America, one name has been all but forgotten in the telling of British Columbia's reluctant journey toward Canadian Confederation: Anthony Musgrave. Better known in this setting as Lord Musgrave. Yet for a brief essential period, in the late 1860s, Musgrave stood as the gatekeeper between imperial inertia and a colony in search of identity. Appointed governor of Newfoundland in 1864, he was a scion of privilege and education. His rise to colonial office was neither accidental nor idle. Musgrave was chosen precisely because the British Foreign and Colonial Office, weary of subsidizing distant territories, needed men who could implement quiet withdrawal through diplomatic persuasion. His position on Confederation was practical, not poetic. In Newfoundland, where Confederation was deeply controversial, Musgrave maneuvered delicately, trying to suppress anti-Confederate sentiment without giving the impression of coercion. Historian P.B. Waite described him as skilled in the gentle art of persuading others to do what they already feared they must. When British Columbia entered the Confederation debate in earnest, Musgrave's experience became the model. He understood that the Empire's goal was not preservation, but consolidation, to bind the British North American colonies together, then slowly retreat.
Now, Governor Frederick Seymour was on a northern tour of inspection on board the big gun vessel, the Sparrowhawk, when his life was terminated through various mysterious circumstances. Some think it might have been alcohol, others think it might have been drugs, maybe it was a heart attack. But in any event, he's the only governor of either of the colonies of British Columbia or Vancouver Island to die on the spot. And he's replaced by Anthony Musgrave, who is a more pro-Confederation man than Seymour is. And I find it quite ironical that he was posted to British Columbia from Newfoundland. And Newfoundland was not in favor of Confederation. And they didn't change their point of view until the famous votes that occurred and Newfoundland joined Canada in the year 1949. So they send a capable governor, a pro-Confederation governor, Anthony Musgrave, to British Columbia, and he fits the bill perfectly because he's a company man, he's a colonial office man. He sees clearly what the need is, and he's the one who carefully nurtures the project. He carefully supports the local politicians. He plays to the press. He encourages the idea of British Columbia joining Confederation.
But Confederation was far from realistic in British Columbia, at least not yet. For one, the economic and geographic distance between Ottawa and Victoria was vast, but more critical was the question of land. The Western Interior, known as Rupert's Land, and the Northwest Territory was still in the hands of the Hudson's Bay Company, a commercial relic with a charter dating to 1670. Until that vast territory was transferred to Canada, there would be no physical or economic bridge between East and West. As Gene Barman noted, Confederation required not just political will, but territorial continuity. Thus, in 1869, the British government and Canadian authorities brokered the purchase of the HBC lands, transferring them to the Dominion of Canada for £300,000. It was the geopolitical equivalent of unlocking continent. In this volatile context arrived Anthony Musgrave, appointed the governor of British Columbia in 1869. Unlike his predecessor, Frederick Seymour, who had resisted the Confederation movement and mourned the fading grandeur of empire, Musgrave was a professional administrator, a man sent to finish a task. His previous governorship in Newfoundland had failed to bring the colony into Confederation, but his methods, conciliatory, shrewd, and firm, were admired by Lord Granville and the Colonial Office. In British Columbia, he was granted a singular mandate: bring the colony into Confederation as quickly and painlessly as possible. Musgrave arrived with the clarity of a man given not instructions, but orders. The Colonial Office had made the objective plain. Union with Canada was no longer a matter of if, but when, and how soon. He landed in Victoria in August of 1869, not as a seeker of consensus, but as a skilled technician of imperial policy, a closer sent to finish the unfinished. His first step was political reconnaissance, a systematic and strategic survey of the colony's fractured political terrain. He held political audiences with members of the Legislative Council and the Executive Council, assessing loyalties, fears, and leverage points. He met directly with the core group of Confederation advocates: John Robson, the principal editor of the British Columbian; Armour de Cosmo, the eccentric yet visionary newspaperman and politician whose tireless campaign for Confederation bordered on evangelical zeal; and Dr. Robert Carroll, a respected medical practitioner from Nanaimo, with one foot in politics and the other in public trust. These men represented the nucleus of pro-Confederation sentiment, and Musgrave quickly recognized their value, not just as voices, but as instruments. But even with such allies, he was entering a house divided. Among the colony's elite, judges, merchants, and officials, there was a deep, almost reflective resistance to change. They had grown comfortable in their quasi-aristocratic sphere, tied by habit and interest to London. These men, many of them of English birth and steeped in imperial etiquette, feared the encroachment of populist politics from the East and recoiled at the thought of surrendering their privileges to a distant and unfamiliar Canadian Parliament. The general populace, meanwhile, was disengaged. Years of economic hardship had dulled political energy. The gold rush was a memory. The debts of grand infrastructure projects like the Caribou Wagon Road were crushing, and many settlers focused more on survival than sovereignty.
He eases the project through. He never presents any obstruction, or he doesn't demonstrate any indifference as Seymour did to the whole project. And he was the perfect fellow in terms of London's point of view for bringing about the arrangement. Remember, it was London that had to sign off on British Columbia joining Canada, and they did so by an order in council which approved of the union of British Columbia with the rest of Canada. And that is completed in July of 1872. Some people wore black, thinking this was the death of British Columbia, but there were many banners that were in favor of it. The press was enthused by it, and the promise of Confederation with all its benefits, financial, and getting rid of the debt of British Columbia was going to be a real benefit for the future.
What Musgrave discerned with cold clarity was that the colony was a tinderbox of stagnation, paralyzed by indecision, but ripe for direction. His genius lay in the crafting of inevitability. Rather than pitch Confederation as an opportunity, he framed it as the only logical escape from ruin. He quietly, yet persistently, underscored that Britain was stepping back. The days of imperial subsidy and military protection were ending. As Musgrave communicated with Lord Granville, the days of imperial subsidy and military protection were ending. As Musgrave communicated with Lord Granville, Secretary of State for the Colonies, he was given full license to make that reality known. Historian Margaret Ormsby observed that Musgrave's correspondence with London was less about seeking instruction and more about confirming what he already intended to do. Simultaneously, Musgrave wielded the specter of American expansionism with finesse. With Alaska now in U.S. hands and the boundary of Washington Territory just south of Victoria, the colony's geopolitical isolation was acute. He reminded his listeners, especially those hesitant members of the Legislative Council, But if the Americans advanced again, there would be no British gunboats in Esquimalt to meet them. He was not threatening. He was simply stating what was understood in Whitehall. The empire was consolidating east of the Rockies. What marked Musgrave's approach was its tactical elegance. He began negotiating terms of union with the Canadian government through informal correspondence and preliminary drafts before the colony's legislature had even cast a vote. It was not, strictly speaking, insubordination. It was momentum. He secured commitments from Ottawa, responsible government, assumption of the colony's debt, yearly subsidies, and most dramatically, the promise of a transcontinental railway. These terms were not just enticements, they were answers to fears. Musgrave understood the choreography of power. He presented a vision in which the colony had only two choices: slow economic and political decay under imperial neglect, or regeneration through Confederation. One was decline, the other was destiny, and to this end, he didn't simply persuade, he orchestrated. He worked the halls of government like a seasoned parliamentarian, ensuring that debate would come and that when it did, it would have the weight of inevitability behind it. He understood the politics of possible. He offered incentives, not least among them the promise of transcontinental railway, which would bind British Columbia to the Dominion in both earn and ambition. Historian Margaret Ormsby called it a masterstroke of colonial salesmanship. Railway tracks laid in words, not yet in steel. Musgrave lobbied hard behind closed doors. He reassured the cautious, flattered the proud, and isolated the opposition. Most significantly, he guided the legislature into debate, not with pressure, but with persuasion. He reminded them again and again that Britain would not come to the colony's defense in the event of war. The subsidies would not flow from London, and that the only path to solvency and sovereignty was Confederation. On April 4, 1870, the Legislative Council voted in favor of union, and Musgrave's terms were sent to Ottawa. They would be accepted with minor alterations. By July 20, 1871, British Columbia would enter Confederation. It did so not through rebellion or revolution, but through a quiet, strategic campaign led by an imperial administrator with a mandate and a deadline. As might have been written, in a world that still believed in the thunder of empire, it was the whisper of diplomacy, calm, persistent, rational, that changed the course of the Pacific frontier. And in that whisper was Anthony Musgrave, doing the empire's last great work, not by holding on, but by letting go, carefully, to trusted hands across the continent. Join us next time for part 16 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series,